The scream tore through the quiet night of Millbrook, and every lamp in every window went dark within seconds, as if the whole town had learned long ago that darkness was safer than being seen. Clara Whitfield pressed her back against the cold stone wall of the old mill, her heart slamming against her ribs, her breath caught somewhere between a sob and a plea. Behind her, heavy footsteps crunched over gravel, slow and unhurried, because the man chasing her knew she had nowhere left to run. She was 19 years old, and for the last 3 years her life had belonged to a man who was not her father, though the whole town called him her guardian. Silas Crane had taken her in after her parents died in the fever that swept through the valley, and for a while people had called him kind for it. But kindness was not the word Clara would have used. Not after the years of locked doors, of harsh words, of debts she never asked to inherit and could never hope to repay. Tonight, Silas had told her the truth at last. He had arranged for her to marry a man twice her age, a man from the next county who owed him money and would forgive that debt in exchange for a wife. Clara had said no. She had said it clearly, standing in the kitchen with her hands shaking, and Silas had raised his hand for the first time in a way that told her this was no longer a request. She had run. Out the back door, past the chicken coop, through the field where the corn stood taller than her shoulders, and down toward the mill at the edge of town, the one place she knew well enough to navigate in the dark. But Silas was not a man who let things go. He had followed her, and now his footsteps were closing in, unhurried because he believed she was trapped. Clara's eyes darted around the small clearing behind the mill. There was nowhere to go. The river was too fast this time of year, swollen from the spring rains, and the only bridge was the long way around, past where Silas now stood. She thought of climbing, of hiding, of 100 small, useless plans, and none of them would save her. That was when she heard it. The soft, steady rhythm of hooves on the dirt road that ran along the river's edge. Not fast, not frantic, but deliberate, the way a man rides when he is in no hurry because he fears nothing in his path. Everyone in Millbrook knew that sound. They called him the Horseman, though he had a name that almost no one used anymore, as if saying it might summon something worse. Children were warned not to wander near the old trail at dusk because of him. Shopkeepers locked their doors early on the night's word came that he had been seen passing through. There were stories, the kind that grew taller with every retelling, about men who had crossed him and were never seen again, about a scar across his jaw that some said came from a knife, and others said came from something far stranger. Nobody knew where he came from. Nobody knew where he slept. He simply appeared, rode through, and vanished like a shadow that belonged to no one. Clara had seen him only once before, from a distance, riding past the edge of the market square on a gray horse with eyes as pale as frost. She remembered how the whole street had gone silent, how mothers had pulled their children close, how even the loudest men in town had lowered their voices until he passed. She remembered thinking, with a strange flicker of curiosity she quickly buried, that he did not look at anyone as he rode. He simply looked ahead, as though the town itself did not exist for him. Now that same rhythm of hooves was drawing closer, and Clara did not know whether to feel relieved or more afraid than ever. A dangerous stranger was riding toward a clearing where a frightened girl stood cornered by a cruel man. There was no reason to believe this would end well for her either way. Silas stepped into the moonlight, his face twisted with anger, his hand already reaching for her wrist. Clara flinched back, and in that instant the horseman rounded the bend in the road, close enough now that the moon caught the shape of him. He was younger than the stories made him sound, though his face carried the kind of weariness that made age hard to guess. He wore a long, dark coat, worn at the edges, and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over eyes that missed nothing. The scar Clara had heard whispered about ran pale and thin along his jaw, and up close it looked less like the mark of a monster, and more like the mark of a man who had survived something terrible. He slowed his horse at the sound of the commotion, and for a long moment he simply watched. Clara felt the weight of his gaze shift from Silas to her, taking in the way she pressed herself against the wall, the way her wrist was already caught in Silas's grip, the fear written plainly across her face. Something in his expression did not change, not exactly, but the stillness around him seemed to sharpen, like a held breath. "This isn't your business, stranger," Silas snapped, his voice carrying the false confidence of a man who did not yet understand what he was looking at. "Move along." The horseman did not move along. He did not speak either, not at first. He simply swung down from his horse with an ease that made the motion look almost gentle, and walked closer, his boots silent on the packed earth in a way that unsettled Clara more than any loud approach could have. Silas's grip on her wrist tightened, and she let out a small, involuntary sound of pain. That sound seemed to decide something in the horseman's mind. He stopped a few paces away, close enough now that Clara could see his eyes were not the frost pale she remembered from the market square, but a deep, steady gray, like the color of a sky before a storm that had not yet decided whether to break. "Let go of her," he said. His voice was low, quiet even, but it carried a weight that made the air feel heavier. There was no anger in it, no threat dressed up in loud words. It was simply a statement, the kind a man makes when he already knows what will happen if he is ignored. Silas laughed, though it came out thin and uncertain. "You don't know who I am or who she is. This girl belongs to my household. She has debts to pay, obligations. This is a family matter." "Let go of her," the horseman repeated, and this time something in his tone made even the crickets in the grass seem to fall silent. Clara watched Silas's face shift from anger to something closer to caution, though his pride would not let him back down entirely, not in front of a girl he considered his property. He gave her wrist one more hard pull, as if to prove he still could, and that was the moment the horseman closed the distance between them. What happened next was fast, but not violent in the way Clara had feared. The horseman caught Silas's arm with a grip that made the older man gasp, twisted it just enough to break his hold on Clara's wrist, and stepped between them in a single fluid motion, as though he had done this 100 times before and grown tired of the repetition. Silas stumbled back, clutching his arm, his face pale with a fear that had replaced his earlier bravado entirely. "Go home," the horseman said, his voice still quiet, still steady. "And do not come looking for her again." Silas opened his mouth as though to argue, but something in the horseman's stillness, in the calm certainty of his stance, convinced him otherwise. He turned and half walked, half stumbled back toward the road, throwing one last glance over his shoulder before disappearing into the dark. For a long moment, neither Clara nor the horseman moved. She stood pressed against the mill wall, her wrist throbbing, her breath coming in short, uneven gasps, staring at the man everyone in town feared and whispered about, who had just stepped between her and the only life she had ever known. He turned to look at her fully for the first time, and up close, the fear the town had built around him seemed to sit strangely on his shoulders, like a coat that did not quite fit. His eyes moved over her face, checking, she realized, for injury, the way someone might check on a stranger they had pulled from a burning building rather than a girl they had rescued from a man's grip. "Are you hurt?" he asked. Clara shook her head, though her wrist still ached, and found she could not quite find her voice. The silence between them stretched, filled only by the sound of the river rushing somewhere beyond the trees and the distant call of a night bird. "You should go home," he said finally, echoing the words he had given Silas, though his tone toward her was entirely different, careful in a way she had not expected from a man the whole town called dangerous. "I can't," Clara said, and the words came out before she had fully decided to say them. "He'll be waiting. He'll make me marry a man I've never met to settle a debt that isn't even mine. I have nowhere else to go." The horseman studied her for a long moment, and Clara had the strange sense that he was weighing something far heavier than her simple statement, some private calculation she could not see. His horse shifted behind him, snorting softly, as if impatient to continue on whatever road it had been traveling before this interruption. "That's not my concern," he said at last, though there was something in his voice that did not quite match the harshness of the words, a hesitation that told her he did not entirely believe what he was saying either. "Please," Clara said, stepping forward despite every instinct that told her to be afraid of this stranger, this man wrapped in rumors of danger and violence. "Take me with you." The words hung in the night air between them, and for a moment the horseman said nothing at all. His gray eyes searched her face as though looking for some sign that she did not mean it, some flicker of doubt he could use as an excuse to ride away and leave her to whatever fate waited for her in Millbrook. But Clara held his gaze, and she did not look away, because she had nothing left to lose by asking, and everything to lose by staying. Somewhere behind them, in the direction of town, a dog began to bark, and lights flickered back to life in a few distant windows, as though the town itself was beginning to stir from its fear. The horseman glanced toward the sound, then back at Clara, and something in his expression shifted, though she could not yet tell into what. He did not answer her plea, not yet. He simply turned back toward his horse, gathering the reins in one hand, leaving Clara standing alone in the clearing with her heart pounding and her question unanswered, the night air cold against her skin, and the sound of the river the only thing filling the silence between them. Clara did not move as the horseman checked the straps on his saddle, his back to her, his silence stretching long enough that she began to fear he had already made his decision and simply had not bothered to say it aloud. The river rushed on behind the trees, indifferent to her fate, and somewhere in the distance, the dog that had started barking finally quieted, leaving only the wind moving through the tall grass. "What's your name?" the horseman asked without turning around. "Clara," she said, "Clara Whitfield." He nodded slowly, as though testing the weight of the name, and finally turned to face her again. "I'm Ronan Blake," he said, and something in the way he offered it plainly, without any of the drama the town had wrapped around him, made her chest loosen just slightly. "People call you other things," Clara said before she could stop herself. "They do," Ronan agreed, and there was no bitterness in it, only a tired kind of acceptance, as though he had long ago stopped expecting anything different from strangers who only knew him through rumor. "Most of it isn't true. Some of it is worse than what's true, and some of it isn't nearly bad enough." Clara did not know what to make of that answer, and she did not have time to ask, because Ronan glanced back toward the road leading into town, his expression sharpening with a wariness she recognized from the way hunted animals watched open fields. "He'll come back," Ronan said, "maybe not tonight. But a man like that doesn't let go of something he considers his, not without help, and not without a grudge." "I know," Clara whispered. "If I take you with me," Ronan continued, his voice careful now, measured in a way that told her he was thinking through consequences she had not yet considered. "There's no going back to a quiet life in a town like this. People will talk. They already fear me, and being seen with me will not make your name any safer in their mouths." "My name isn't safe here anyway," Clara said. "It hasn't been safe since my parents died." Something flickered across Ronan's face at that, something that looked almost like recognition, as though her words had touched a memory of his own that he did not care to share. He was quiet for a long moment, studying her the way a man studies a road before deciding whether it is worth the risk of traveling. "I don't stay in one place long," he said finally. "I don't have a home to offer you, not in the way you mean it. I have a horse, a saddlebag, and roads that most people are too afraid to travel with me. That's not much of a life for someone like you." "It's more than staying here," Clara said, and her voice did not waver, even though her hands still trembled at her sides. "I would rather face an uncertain road with a stranger than a certain one with a man who already broke every promise he made to protect me." Ronan studied her for a long moment, and Clara held his gaze, refusing to let the fear crawling up her spine show on her face. Finally, he let out a slow breath, and something in his shoulders eased, just slightly, as though he had made peace with a decision he was not entirely sure was wise. "Get on," he said, nodding toward the horse. "We ride through the night. I want distance between us and this town before morning." Relief flooded through Clara so suddenly that her knees nearly buckled, and she had to steady herself against the mill wall before stepping forward. Ronan helped her up onto the horse with a careful, practiced motion, and within minutes, they were moving through the dark countryside, the lights of Millbrook shrinking behind them until they disappeared entirely into the folds of the hills. They rode in silence for a long while, the only sounds the steady rhythm of hooves against the dirt road and the occasional call of an owl somewhere in the trees. Clara held on loosely, unsure of how close she was allowed to sit, painfully aware of the stranger's presence in front of her, the warmth of him against the cold night air, the quiet strength in the way he controlled the horse without seeming to try at all. "Where are we going?" she finally asked when the silence became too heavy to bear. "Away," Ronan said simply. "For now, that's the only answer that matters." They rode until the sky began to lighten at the edges. A pale gray creeping over the hills that promised dawn was not far off. Ronan finally slowed the horse near a small stream shaded by a stand of old willow trees, and dismounted, offering Clara his hand to help her down. Her legs were stiff from hours of riding, and she stumbled slightly as her feet touched the ground, catching herself against his arm before quickly stepping back, embarrassed. "We'll rest here a few hours," Ronan said, already moving to unstrap a bedroll from behind the saddle. "The horse needs water, and so do we. We'll move again once the sun is fully up." Clara nodded, watching him work with quiet efficiency, tying the horse loosely near the stream, laying out the bedroll on a patch of soft grass, gathering a small handful of dry twigs for a fire he built with a speed and skill that spoke of long practice. She realized, watching him, that this was a man who had spent far more nights alone under open sky than he had spent under any roof, and something about that realization made her feel both more curious about him and more aware of how little she truly knew. "You don't have to be afraid of me," Ronan said, without looking up from the small fire he had coaxed to life. "I know what they say about me in towns like Millbrook. I know the stories, but I've never harmed anyone who didn't put a blade or worse in my path first." "I wasn't afraid," Clara said, though the words came out less certain than she intended. Ronan glanced up at her then, and for just a moment something like amusement flickered across his tired eyes, softening the sharp lines of his face. "You were," he said, not unkindly. "It's all right, most people are at first." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she did not deny it again. Instead, she settled onto the grass a careful distance from the fire, pulling her knees up to her chest, watching the flames dance and crackle in the pale early light. "Why does everyone fear you so much?" she asked. "The stories they tell about men who cross you never being seen again, is any of it true?" Ronan was quiet for a long moment, feeding another twig into the fire, watching it catch and burn before answering. "Some of it started true, a long time ago," he said finally. "There was a time when I rode with people who did terrible things, and I was young enough and angry enough to go along with it. I've spent a good many years since then trying to undo the reputation that time left behind, but reputations travel faster and live longer than the truth ever does." Clara studied his face in the firelight, searching for the danger the town had warned her about, and finding instead only weariness, the kind that came from carrying a weight far too long. "What happened?" she asked softly, "to make you leave that life?" Ronan's jaw tightened, and for a moment Clara thought he would refuse to answer, would retreat behind the same wall of silence that had surrounded him since she first saw him ride into Millbrook's market square. But instead, he let out a slow breath, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter than before. "Someone I cared about paid the price for choices that weren't hers to make," he said. "I won't say more than that tonight. It's not a story for the first hours of a new road." Clara did not press him further, sensing the boundary in his words, respecting it the way she wished Sela's had ever respected hers. Instead, she watched the fire in silence, feeling the exhaustion of the night finally catching up to her, her eyelids growing heavy despite the strangeness of her surroundings. "Sleep," Ronan said, noticing her fading. "I'll keep watch. Nothing will reach you here." There was something in the certainty of his voice, in the quiet confidence of a man who had clearly kept watch over countless nights and countless fires, that made Clara believe him completely, more completely than she had believed any promise in years. She lay back on the edge of the bedroll he had laid out for her, pulling her coat tighter against the cool morning air, and within minutes, sleep pulled her under, deeper and more peaceful than any rest she had known in Sela's Crane's house. When she woke hours later, the sun was high overhead, filtering gently through the willow branches above her. Ronan sat a short distance away, sharpening a small knife with slow, methodical strokes, his eyes scanning the horizon every few moments out of what seemed like pure habit rather than immediate worry. The horse grazed peacefully nearby, and for the first time in longer than Clara could remember, the world felt quiet in a way that did not feel like the calm before another storm. "You're awake," Ronan said, not looking up from the knife. "Good, we should eat and then we ride again. I want more distance before nightfall." Clara sat up, brushing dry grass from her sleeves, and looked at him properly in the daylight. This man the whole region feared, this stranger who had somehow become, in the space of a single night, the only person standing between her and a life she had not chosen. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for last night, for not turning me away." Ronan finally looked up, and something in his gray eyes softened, just slightly, the way stone softens under years of steady rain. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "The road ahead isn't an easy one, and Silas Crane isn't the kind of man who lets go of a grudge quietly. We should be ready for that, both of us." Clara nodded, understanding the warning beneath his words, but she found that even the thought of danger ahead could not dampen the strange, fragile relief settling in her chest. For the first time in years, she was not trapped. She was not powerless, and whatever came next, she would not face it alone. They rode for 3 days before real trouble found them. 3 days of quiet roads in small, cautious towns where Ronan bought supplies without lingering long enough for questions to form on anyone's lips. Clara learned quickly that he moved through the world like a man who had trained himself never to be remembered, choosing back roads over main streets, paying in exact coin so no one had reason to look too closely at his face, keeping his hat low whenever they passed through anywhere with more than a handful of houses. On the evening of the 3rd day, they made camp in a shallow valley beside a slow-moving creek, far enough from the nearest town that the smoke from their fire would not draw attention. Clara had grown more comfortable in his presence by then, enough to ask questions without fearing his temper, enough to notice the small things about him that the town's rumors had never captured. The way he always checked the horse's hooves before checking his own boots. The way he never ate until he had first offered her a share, even when supplies were thin. The way his eyes softened slightly whenever she laughed at something, as though the sound surprised him each time. "You've been quiet about where we're actually headed," Clara said, poking at the fire with a long stick while Ronan cleaned his rifle a short distance away. An old habit he performed every evening with the same careful attention a craftsman gives to a beloved tool. "There's a town 2 days east," Ronan said, not looking up from his work. "Cedar Hollow, smaller than Millbrook, quieter. An old friend of mine runs the general store there. She'll let us stay a while, ask no questions, and give us a place to plan what comes next." "You have friends," Clara said, and immediately regretted the surprise in her voice. Ronan glanced up, one eyebrow raised, though there was no real offense in his expression. "Not many," he admitted, "but the ones I have I trust with my life. Nora's one of them. Known her longer than I've known most anything." Clara wanted to ask more, wanted to understand the shape of the life this man had lived before she stumbled into it. But the sound of distant hooves on hard-packed dirt cut through the quiet evening air, and Ronan's entire posture shifted in an instant. He set the rifle down, rose to his feet in one smooth motion, and moved toward the edge of their small camp, his eyes fixed on the ridge above them where the sound seemed to be coming from. "Get behind the rocks," he said quietly, his voice carrying none of the gentleness from moments before, replaced now by a hard, focused calm that made Clara's stomach twist with fear. "Stay low. Stay quiet." Clara did as he said, pressing herself into the shadow of a large boulder near the creek, her heart hammering as she watched Ronan move to intercept whoever was approaching, his hand resting near the rifle he had picked back up without seeming to hurry, though every motion carried a readiness she had not seen from him before. 3 riders crested the ridge and made their way down into the valley, and Clara recognized 2 of them immediately, even in the fading light. Silas Crane rode at the front, flanked by 2 men she knew from Millbrook hired hands who worked odd jobs around town and were not known for asking questions when paid well enough. Silas had found them. "Ronan Blake," Silas called out, his voice carrying false confidence across the valley, though Clara could hear the tension threaded beneath it. You've made a mistake, taking what belongs to another man. She doesn't belong to anyone, Ronan said, his voice low and even, carrying easily across the quiet evening air despite its softness. You should turn around and ride back the way you came, Crane, before this becomes a mistake you can't take back. Silas laughed, though it came out thinner than he probably intended, and gestured toward his two companions, both of whom shifted uneasily in their saddles, clearly less certain about this confrontation than the man who had hired them. There are 3 of us, Silas said, and 1 of you. I'd say the odds favor a different outcome than the one you're imagining. Numbers aren't everything, Ronan said, and something in his stillness, in the calm certainty radiating from him even as 3 men faced him down, made even Clara's fear shift briefly into something closer to awe. Ask your friends there if they've heard what happened to the last men who tried this particular arithmetic against me. One of the hired men shifted visibly at that, exchanging a nervous glance with the other, and Clara realized that whatever reputation followed Ronan through the countryside, it carried enough weight to unsettle even men who had not personally witnessed whatever incidents had built it. Silas noticed the hesitation too, and his confidence flickered just slightly before he steadied it with visible effort. This doesn't have to end badly for anyone, Silas said, his tone shifting into something more reasonable, more negotiating, though Clara knew better than to trust the sudden softness in his voice. Give the girl back and we ride away, no trouble for anyone. She has debts, obligations, things that don't simply disappear because a stranger decides to play protector. The only debt I see here, Ronan said, is the one you owe her, for every year you kept her under your roof and called it kindness while treating her like property. That debt doesn't get settled by handing her to a man she's never met, and it certainly doesn't get settled tonight, by you or anyone riding with you. Silas's face darkened, the reasonable mask slipping away entirely, replaced by the same anger Clara remembered from the clearing behind the mill. You don't know what you're protecting, he snapped. You don't know her, don't know what she's worth, what she owes. This is not your fight, Horseman. It is now, Ronan said simply, and something in the finality of those 3 words seemed to settle the matter for everyone present, even the 2 hired men, who exchanged another glance, and this time began, subtly, to ease their horses backward, away from whatever confrontation was clearly about to unfold. Silas noticed their retreat and his composure cracked further, fury and fear warring visibly across his face. You too, I'm paying you for a job, he snapped, though his voice had lost the commanding edge it carried moments before. Not enough to face him, one of the men muttered, already turning his horse fully around. Word around Millbrook says he took down 4 men outside Cedar Hollow last spring and they were armed better than us. I've got a family, Crane. This isn't worth it. The other man nodded in agreement, and within moments, both hired hands had turned and ridden back up the ridge, leaving Silas alone at the edge of the valley, his fury now unmasked and directed entirely at the man standing calm and unmoved before him. For a long moment, Silas simply sat on his horse, breathing hard, clearly calculating whether pride was worth the risk of facing Ronan Blake alone. Pride, it seemed, was not quite enough. Silas spat something bitter under his breath, wheeled his horse around, and rode back up the ridge without another word, disappearing into the darkening evening in the same direction his hired men had gone. Clara remained pressed against the boulder for a long moment after the sound of hooves faded entirely, her whole body trembling with the release of tension she had been holding since the riders first appeared. Ronan lowered the rifle slowly, his shoulders finally relaxing from the rigid readiness they had held throughout the confrontation, and turned to find her still hidden by the creek. You can come out, he said gently. They're gone, for tonight at least. Clara stepped out from behind the rock on unsteady legs, and before she fully registered the motion, she had crossed the distance between them and wrapped her arms around him, her face pressed against his shoulder, the fear and relief of the last several minutes finally breaking through the composure she had tried so hard to maintain. Ronan went still for a moment, clearly unaccustomed to the gesture, before his arms came up slowly, carefully, around her shoulders, offering the kind of steady comfort that felt entirely unfamiliar to him, and yet came naturally all the same. "He'll come back," Clara whispered against his shoulder, her voice muffled and shaking. "Won't he? With more men next time, or a different plan?" "Probably," Ronan admitted, and she appreciated, even through her fear, that he did not lie to comfort her. Men like Silas Crane don't let go easily, not when their pride is wounded. But you're not facing that alone anymore, Clara. Whatever comes, we'll meet it together. Clara pulled back slightly to look up at him, and in the dim light of the fading evening, she studied his face properly for the first time since that first terrifying night behind the mill. The scar along his jaw, the weariness etched into lines around his gray eyes, the quiet strength that seemed to live not in loud displays but in the simple steadiness of his presence. The town had called him a monster, a man to be feared and avoided, and yet here he stood, having just faced down 3 armed men to protect a girl he had known for only 3 days, asking nothing in return. "Thank you," she said again, the words feeling insufficient against the weight of what he had just done, but unable to find any others that fit better. Ronan offered a small, tired smile, the first genuine one she had seen cross his face since they met. "We should move camp before full dark," he said, "just in case Crane finds his courage again before morning. Better to be somewhere he doesn't know to look." They broke camp quickly and quietly, moving another few miles before settling in a hidden hollow surrounded by thick brush, far enough from the road that any approach would be heard long before it arrived. As Clara finally settled onto her bedroll that night, exhausted but strangely calmer than she had felt in years, she found herself watching Ronan across the dying embers of their small fire, this man the world called dangerous, who had somehow, in the space of only a few days, become the safest thing in her entire life. Cedar Hollow turned out to be smaller than Clara had imagined, a cluster of wooden buildings gathered around a single dusty street, with a general store at its center that seemed to serve as the heart of the entire settlement. The woman who ran it, a sharp-eyed, silver-haired figure named Nora Fenwick, greeted Ronan with the kind of easy familiarity that spoke of years of trust, pulling him into a brief, fierce hug before turning her assessing gaze on Clara. "So this is the one you wrote me about," Nora said, studying Clara with an intensity that made her feel oddly transparent, though there was warmth beneath the scrutiny rather than judgment. "You've had quite a week from what I hear." "You wrote to her?" Clara asked, turning to Ronan with surprise. She had not seen him send any letters during their journey, had not even realized he had the means to do so from the road. "Sent word ahead with a rider we passed the first morning," Ronan said, setting their bags down just inside the store's back room, a small but comfortable space Nora clearly kept ready for exactly this kind of unexpected arrival. "Figured we might need somewhere safe sooner rather than later, given how Crane responded that first night." Nora busied herself preparing a simple meal while Clara and Ronan settled at the small table in the back room. And as the evening wore on, Clara found herself relaxing in a way she had not expected, the warmth of the room and the easy conversation between old friends creating a sense of safety that felt almost foreign after years spent constantly watching for Silas Crane's moods. "You should know," Nora said at one point, setting a plate in front of Clara with a gentleness that made her throat tighten unexpectedly, "that whatever this one tells you about himself, whatever reputation follows him through these hills, he spent more years trying to undo harm than he ever spent causing it. I've known Ronan Blake since he was barely older than you are now, back when he was running with men who deserved every terrible story told about them. He got out. Not many do." Ronan shifted uncomfortably at the praise, focusing intently on his own meal, and Clara found herself curious despite the clear discomfort her question would cause. "What happened?" she asked carefully. "How did you get out?" For a long moment, Ronan said nothing, and Clara worried she had pushed too far, too soon, into territory he had made clear on their first night together that he was not ready to share. But eventually, he set down his fork, and when he spoke, his voice carried a rawness she had not heard from him before. "I rode with a group led by a man named Garrett Voss," he said slowly. We told ourselves we were righting wrongs, taking from those who'd stolen from others first, protecting towns that couldn't protect themselves. For a while, maybe that was even partly true, but power changes people, and Voss changed faster than any of us wanted to admit. By the end, we weren't protecting anyone. We were just taking what we wanted, and calling it justice because that made it easier to live with. Clara listened in silence, watching the pain move across his features, understanding now why the town's rumors had painted him in such stark, frightening colors, and understanding too how far that reputation had drifted from the man sitting across from her now. There was a girl in one of the towns we rode through, Ronan continued, his voice growing quieter still. Younger than you. Her family tried to stop us from taking their livestock, their last means of surviving the winter, and things went wrong faster than any of us expected. She got hurt trying to protect her little brother. I tried to stop it, but I wasn't fast enough, wasn't strong enough within the group to change what had already been set in motion. She survived, but barely, and I rode away from that group within the week, unable to live with what I'd allowed to happen. That wasn't your fault, Clara said softly, reaching across the table to touch his hand before she fully decided to do so. Ronan looked down at her hand covering his, and something in his expression softened, though the guilt in his eyes did not fully disappear. Maybe not entirely, he said, but I was there. I was part of it, even at the end when I hated every moment of it. I've spent years since then trying to be someone who stops harm instead of causing it, but the stories from those earlier years travel faster than any change a man makes afterward. People remember the danger. They rarely stay around long enough to see what a person becomes after. I see it, Clara said quietly and meant it completely. Nora, who had been quietly clearing dishes while they talked, paused and looked between them with an expression that held both affection and something like careful hope. He's a good man, she said simply. Been one for a long while now, whatever the tavern's 3 counties over might say about him. Don't let old ghosts convince either of you otherwise. The evening wound down into a comfortable quiet, and Nora offered Clara a small room upstairs, insisting she rest properly after days on the road, while Ronan took up a position near the front window, keeping watch out of habit even in a place he clearly trusted. Clara lay awake for a long while that night, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling, turning over everything she had learned about the man who had become her unlikely protector. The next morning brought unwelcome news. A young boy from a neighboring farm arrived at the store just after dawn, breathless from running, with word that had traveled through the county overnight. Silas Crane had gone to the local magistrate, claiming Clara had been kidnapped against her will, twisting the truth into something that painted Ronan as a dangerous criminal, and Clara as an innocent victim stolen from her rightful guardian's care. A bounty had been posted, not enormous, but enough to tempt opportunists across several counties into taking an interest in finding them. That's not true, Clara said, horror creeping through her as the boy relayed the details Nora translated from his breathless account. None of that is true. I asked him to take me. I begged him. Doesn't matter what's true, Ronan said grimly, already moving to check his rifle and gather their few belongings. Only matters what's believed, and Crane knows exactly how to make a story believable to men who want an excuse to collect a bounty. We can't stay in Cedar Hollow. If word of the bounty spreads here, it puts Nora at risk too, for harboring us. Nora waved off the concern with characteristic bluntness, but even she agreed they needed to move, needed distance, and a plan more solid than simply staying ahead of whoever came looking. As they packed hurriedly, Clara felt the fragile peace of the last day slipping away, replaced by the familiar, exhausting fear that had followed her since that first night behind the mill. Where do we go now? She asked, watching Ronan tighten the straps on his saddle with quick, efficient motions. There's a magistrate 2 towns over in Ashworth, Ronan said, not looking up from his work. A fair one from what I've heard, not the kind who takes bribes or believes every convenient story brought to his desk. If we can get to him before Crane's version of events spreads any further, tell him the truth ourselves, show him the bruises Crane left on your wrist that first night, we might have a chance at ending this the right way, through the law instead of running forever. And if he doesn't believe us? Clara asked, the fear plain in her voice. Ronan finally looked up, meeting her eyes with the same steady certainty that had carried her through every frightening moment since they met. "Then we find another way," he said. "But we don't run forever, Clara. You deserve a life that isn't built on constantly looking over your shoulder. I intend to help you get one, however long that takes." Nora pressed a small bundle of supplies into Clara's hands as they prepared to leave, along with a fierce, quick hug that surprised her with its warmth. "You come back through here once this is settled," Nora said. "Both of you. I'll want to hear how it ends." They rode out of Cedar Hollow just as the sun cleared the eastern hills, leaving behind the brief comfort of Nora's small store and heading toward Ashworth, and whatever uncertain reckoning waited for them there. Clara held on a little tighter than before as they rode, aware now of the bounty hanging over their heads, the false story spreading through the county, the danger that had shifted from simply personal into something with legal weight behind it. And yet, even with the fear pressing against her chest, Clara found she did not regret the plea she had made that first terrifying night. Whatever came next, whatever dangers Ashworth held, she was no longer the frightened girl trapped behind the mill wall, waiting for someone else to decide her fate. She had a protector who had already proven, more than once, that he would stand between her and harm without hesitation, and for the first time in years, she felt something that had been missing from her life for far too long. She felt hope. The road to Ashworth wound through thicker forest than any they had traveled so far, tall pines pressing close on either side, filtering the sunlight into shifting patterns across the dirt path ahead of them. Ronan kept a slower pace than usual, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line, and Clara had learned enough about his habits by now to understand that his caution meant he expected trouble somewhere along this particular stretch of road. "You think Crane sent someone ahead of us," she said, more statement than question. "I think a bounty draws attention from people who don't ask many questions about the truth of a story," Ronan replied. "And this road is exactly the kind of place someone might choose to wait for travelers they'd rather not meet in open daylight." His instincts proved right within the hour. As they rounded a bend where the trees grew thickest, two men stepped out onto the path ahead, rifles raised, their faces set with the particular hardness of men who had convinced themselves that money justified whatever came next. Behind them, Clara caught sight of a third figure hanging back among the trees, watching rather than participating, and something about his posture struck her as different from the other two, more hesitant. "That's them," one of the men called back over his shoulder, not quite masking the nervousness in his voice despite the confidence of his raised weapon. "Matches the description perfect. Girl and the Horseman both." Ronan drew his own horse to a slow stop, positioning himself carefully between Clara and the armed men, his hand resting near his rifle though he had not yet drawn it. "There's a bounty on us built from a lie," he said, his voice carrying the same calm steadiness Clara had come to associate with him facing danger. "The girl came with me by her own choice. You're welcome to ride to Ashworth and hear the truth from a magistrate before you do anything you'll regret." "Truth don't pay near as well as this bounty does," the second man said, though his rifle wavered slightly, and Clara noticed his eyes darting toward his companion as though seeking reassurance he was not entirely finding. "You've heard the stories about me," Ronan said, his tone shifting into something harder, more deliberate. "Ask yourselves honestly whether this particular bounty is worth testing, whether those stories are true." The tension stretched taut across the clearing, and Clara held her breath, watching the two armed men exchange another uncertain glance. It was the third man, the one who had hung back among the trees, who finally broke the silence, stepping forward with his hands raised, empty of any weapon. "This ain't right," he said, addressing his companions rather than Ronan. "I told you both back at the tavern something about that story didn't sit well with me. Look at her." He gestured toward Clara, his expression uncertain but sincere. "Does she look like a girl who was taken against her will? She's sitting there calm as anything, not tied, not gagged, riding right alongside him." The doubt in his voice seemed to spread to his companions, both of whom lowered their rifles slightly. their earlier confidence visibly cracking under the weight of a question none of them had apparently considered too carefully before agreeing to this ambush. "Is that true?" the first man asked, addressing Clara directly for the first time. "Did he take you against your will, girl, or is there more to this story than what we heard back in town?" Clara straightened in her saddle, drawing on a courage she had not known she possessed before these last several days, and met the man's gaze directly. "I begged him to take me," she said clearly, her voice steady despite the danger still present in the moment. "Silas Crane is not my father, not my true guardian in any way that matters. He kept me for 3 years after my parents died, and when I refused to marry a man I'd never met to settle a debt that was never mine, he turned violent. Ronan Blake saved me that night, and every story Crane has spread since is a lie meant to protect his own reputation and punish me for refusing him." The three men exchanged uncertain glances again, and Clara could see the calculation happening behind their eyes, weighing the promised bounty against the growing suspicion that they had been sent on a fool's errand built on false pretenses. Finally, the third man, the one who had first voiced doubt, lowered his rifle entirely and stepped further back from the confrontation. "I'm not risking my life or my conscience for Silas Crane's money," he said. "Never liked the man much anyway, if I'm honest. Something about him always felt wrong, even before this." His companions, seeing the group's resolve crumbling, followed suit more slowly, lowering their weapons with visible reluctance, clearly still calculating whether the bounty was worth pursuing through some other means. "This isn't over," the first man muttered, though the threat carried little conviction. "Crane's got money, and money finds other people willing to look the other way about a girl's protests." "Then we'll deal with those people when they come," Ronan said evenly. "Same as we've dealt with you." The three men retreated back into the trees, and Clara let out a long, shaking breath she had not realized she was holding, her hands trembling against the reins as the adrenaline of the confrontation slowly drained away. Ronan reached over and steadied her horse gently, his eyes checking her over with the same careful concern he had shown that very first night behind the mill. "You did well," he said quietly. "Better than well. You spoke for yourself, and it mattered more than anything I could have said on your behalf." "I was terrified," Clara admitted, her voice still unsteady. "Terrified and steady aren't opposites," Ronan said, a rare small smile touching his lips. "The bravest thing I've ever seen isn't the absence of fear, it's speaking the truth despite it." They pushed on toward Ashworth with renewed urgency, both aware that the encounter on the forest road was likely only the first of many such tests they would face before this was truly settled. By late afternoon, the trees finally gave way to open farmland, and the town of Ashworth came into view, larger and more established than either Millbrook or Cedar Hollow, with a proper courthouse standing at its center, its white columns visible even from a distance. They found the magistrate's office attached to the courthouse, and after a brief wait, were shown into a modest room where a gray-haired man with sharp, attentive eyes sat behind a cluttered desk, introducing himself as Magistrate Aldous Fairweather. Clara felt her nerves rising again as Ronan explained their situation, but the magistrate listened with a patience and careful attention that gradually eased some of her fear. "I've had word of this bounty already," Fairweather admitted, once Ronan finished laying out the sequence of events that had brought them to his office. "A rider came through 2 days ago with Mr. Crane's version of the story. I confess it struck me as somewhat exaggerated even before hearing your account, given what little I know of Silas Crane's reputation in these parts." He turned his attention to Clara directly, his expression softening slightly. "I'd like to hear your account in your own words, if you're willing, Miss Whitfield. Every detail you can remember from the very beginning." Clara took a steadying breath and began to speak, recounting the years under Silas Crane's guardianship, the growing control and cruelty that had crept into their household after her parents' death, the arranged marriage she had been informed of without any say in the matter, and finally, the night she fled to the mill and found Ronan Blake instead of the harm she had feared. She spoke of the bruise Crane's grip had left on her wrist that first night, still faintly visible even now, and of the desperation that had led her to beg a stranger for rescue rather than face the fate Crane had arranged for her. Magistrate Fairweather listened without interruption, occasionally jotting notes on a paper before him, his expression growing steadily more troubled as Clara's account continued. When she finished, he set down his pen and regarded them both with a thoughtful, measured expression. "This is a serious accusation against a respected member of the Millbrook community," he said slowly, "and I won't pretend that pursuing it will be simple. Silas Crane has some standing in that county, and men of standing are often given the benefit of doubt that others aren't afforded. But your account is detailed, consistent, and frankly more believable than the story he sent ahead of you. I'll need to formally investigate, gather testimony, perhaps send word to others in Millbrook who might have witnessed his treatment of you over these years." "How long will that take?" Ronan asked. "There's a bounty on our heads in the meantime, and men willing to collect it don't much care whether the underlying claim is true." "I can issue an order suspending the bounty while the investigation proceeds," Fairweather said, already reaching for a fresh sheet of paper. "That should discourage most opportunists, though I won't promise it eliminates every risk entirely. Men desperate or foolish enough sometimes act regardless of legal standing." He paused, studying them both with a considering expression. "I'd also recommend you both remain nearby, within reach of this court, until matters are resolved. Fleeing further would only lend credibility to Crane's version of events, however unfair that might seem given the truth of your situation." Clara felt a fresh wave of anxiety at the thought of staying in one place long enough for Silas to potentially find them again, but she understood the wisdom in the magistrate's advice. Running forever was not a life, and if there was a genuine chance at ending this properly, through the law rather than constant flight, it seemed worth the risk of staying still long enough to see it through. "We'll stay," Ronan said, glancing at Clara for confirmation, which she offered with a small, determined nod. "Where would you suggest, given the circumstances?" Fairweather considered for a moment before answering. "There's a small farmhouse just outside town, belonging to a widow named Agnes Marrow. She occasionally takes in boarders, and I trust her discretion. I'll speak with her myself, explain enough of the situation to ensure her cooperation without exposing you to unnecessary risk. It should serve well enough until this investigation concludes." As they left the magistrate's office that evening, the weight of uncertainty still heavy despite the small progress made, Clara found herself studying Ronan's profile in the fading light. This man who had ridden into her desperate plea without hesitation, and had not once, in all the days since, given her reason to regret the choice she made that terrifying night behind the mill. Whatever dangers still lay ahead, whatever schemes Silas Crane might yet attempt, she no longer faced them as the frightened, powerless girl she had been. She faced them as someone learning, slowly but surely, what it meant to stand her ground and be believed. Agnes Marrow's farmhouse sat at the edge of a wide meadow, weathered but sturdy, surrounded by fields of tall grass that swayed gently in the evening breeze. The widow herself proved to be a practical, kind-hearted woman who asked few questions beyond what was necessary, offering Clara and Ronan separate rooms with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to managing a household alone since her husband's passing years earlier. The days that followed settled into an unfamiliar rhythm for Clara, one built not around fear and careful watchfulness, but around small, ordinary tasks that felt almost luxurious in their simplicity. She helped Agnes in the garden each morning, learned to mend torn clothing properly for the first time in years, and found herself, in quiet moments, simply sitting beneath the old oak tree near the farmhouse, watching clouds drift across an open sky without the constant weight of dread pressing against her chest. Ronan remained watchful, as was his nature, checking the perimeter of the property each evening, keeping his rifle close even during the quietest afternoons, but even he seemed to soften slightly in the peaceful atmosphere of the farmhouse, the tension that had defined their journey gradually giving way to something calmer, more sustainable. One warm evening, nearly a week after their arrival, Clara found him sitting alone near the small pond at the edge of Agnes's property, watching the last light of sunset paint the water in shades of orange and gold. She settled beside him without asking permission, and for a while neither of them spoke, content simply to share the quiet. "You seem different here," Clara said eventually, breaking the comfortable silence. "Less guarded, maybe." Ronan considered the observation for a moment before responding. "It's strange," he admitted. "I haven't had a place to simply sit and watch the sunset in longer than I can remember. Most of my nights over the past several years have been spent watching roads, watching shadows, waiting for trouble that usually came eventually." "Does it ever get tiring?" Clara asked. "Always watching, always waiting." "More than I usually admit," he said, and something in his honesty surprised her, given how carefully he typically guarded his own feelings. "There were years I told myself the constant vigilance was necessary, a fair price for the mistakes of my past. But sitting here, now, I'm beginning to wonder if I've simply grown used to punishing myself long after any real punishment was warranted." Clara studied his profile in the fading light, the scar along his jaw catching the last golden rays of the setting sun, and found herself wanting, more than she had wanted almost anything in recent memory, to understand this man more fully beyond the fragments he had shared so far. "Tell me about her," she said softly. "The girl you mentioned back in Voss's group, the one who got hurt." Ronan's jaw tightened slightly, but he did not withdraw from the question the way he might have during their earlier days together. "Her name was Eliza," he said quietly. "She was maybe 15, protecting her younger brother when things went wrong. I still remember the sound she made, the fear in her eyes when she realized none of us were going to stop what was happening in time." He paused, his hands tightening slightly where they rested on his knees. "I visited her family once, years later, after I'd left Voss's group entirely. Wanted to see if there was anything I could do to make amends, however small. Her mother wouldn't let me pass the front gate. Told me some wounds don't heal, just because the person who caused them feels sorry afterward." "That must have been hard to hear," Clara said gently. "It was fair," Ronan replied. "I didn't argue with her. I simply left, and I've carried that conversation with me ever since, as a reminder of exactly what kind of harm comes from standing by while others do wrong, even when you tell yourself you disagree with it internally. Since then, I've tried to be someone who doesn't stand by, someone who steps in, even when it's dangerous, even when it costs something." "Like you did for me," Clara said quietly. Ronan turned to look at her then, his gray eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her breath catch slightly. "Like I did for you," he agreed. "Though I'll admit, that first night I nearly rode past, told myself it wasn't my business, the same excuse I'd used too many times before. It was the sound you made when Crane's grip tightened on your wrist that changed my mind. Reminded me too much of Eliza's cry, and I couldn't ride past a second time and live with myself afterward." Clara felt her throat tighten with emotion, understanding now the deeper weight behind his rescue that night, the personal reckoning he had been fighting even as he stepped between her and Sela's Crane. "I'm grateful you didn't ride past," she said softly. "More grateful than I think I've properly expressed." "You don't owe me gratitude," Ronan said, though his voice carried a warmth that softened the words. "Whatever this is, whatever we're building on this road together, it's not a debt to be repaid, Clara. I want you to understand that clearly." "Then what is it?" Clara asked, the question slipping out before she fully considered its weight. Ronan was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving over her face in the fading light, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a vulnerability she had not heard from him before, not even during his account of Eliza and the mistakes of his past. "I'm not entirely certain," he admitted. "I've spent so many years keeping people at a careful distance, convincing myself that solitude was simpler, safer for everyone involved. But these past weeks with you, I've found myself wanting things I'd stopped allowing myself to want. Company that isn't purely practical. Conversation that isn't just about the next threat on the road. Someone whose safety matters to me, beyond the simple duty of protection." Clara's heart pounded at his words, and she found herself leaning slightly closer without fully deciding to do so. "I feel it too," she said quietly. Somewhere between that first terrifying night and now, you stopped being simply the frightening stranger who saved me and became someone I genuinely care for. Someone I want beside me, not just as protection, but because of who you actually are. The space between them seemed to shrink further, the last light of sunset casting everything in warm, gentle gold. And for a long moment, neither of them moved, caught in the fragile, uncertain space between friendship and something deeper neither had quite named aloud until now. Ronan reached out slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, and gently brushed a strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering briefly against her cheek. "I don't want to rush this," he said softly. "You've had enough taken from you without your consent. Whatever grows between us, I want it to be something you choose freely, without any pressure from gratitude or circumstance." "I am choosing it," Clara said, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. "Freely and with clear eyes, Ronan, this isn't gratitude. It's something I want for its own sake." The kiss that followed was soft, careful, both of them moving slowly as though testing the fragile new ground between them. And when they finally pulled apart, Clara felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled for as long as she could remember. A sense of belonging she had not known since before her parents' death, found unexpectedly in the presence of a man the whole world had taught her to fear. They sat together by the pond until the stars emerged fully overhead, talking quietly of smaller things now, favorite childhood memories, foods they missed, small dreams neither had allowed themselves to voice in longer than either cared to admit. Clara learned that Ronan had once dreamed of raising horses on land of his own, a dream he had abandoned during his years with Voss's group and never quite allowed himself to reclaim since. She shared her own memories of her parents' small farm before the fever took them, the quiet, ordinary happiness she had lost and had begun, cautiously, to hope she might find again. When they finally returned to the farmhouse that night, Agnes offered them both a knowing look over the dinner she had kept warm, saying nothing directly but smiling in a way that suggested she had noticed the shift between them regardless. Clara found herself smiling back, a genuine, unguarded expression that felt foreign after years of careful restraint under Silas Crane's roof. The peace of those days at the farmhouse, however, could not last indefinitely, and both of them knew it, even as they allowed themselves brief moments of happiness amid the uncertainty still hanging over their future. Word arrived 3 days later, carried by a breathless messenger from Magistrate Fairweather's office, that would shatter the fragile calm they had built and pull them back toward the reckoning neither could avoid forever. The messenger arrived breathless and pale, having ridden hard from Ashworth's courthouse, and his news struck the quiet peace of the farmhouse like a stone through glass. Silas Crane had grown impatient with the slow pace of the magistrate's investigation, and rather than wait for the process to run its course, he had gathered a group of men loyal to him through debt or fear, and was riding toward the farmhouse himself, intent on settling the matter through force before the law could rule against him. "How far behind you is he?" Ronan asked, already moving toward the door to check on his horse, his earlier calm replaced by the sharp, focused readiness Clara had seen only during genuine danger. "Perhaps 2 hours," the messenger said, still catching his breath. "Magistrate Fairweather sent me ahead as fast as I could ride, and he's gathering what constables he can to follow behind, but Ashworth is small, and most of the able men are out working the harvest. He may not arrive in time." Clara felt the familiar grip of fear returning, tightening around her chest in a way she had almost forgotten during the peaceful days at the farmhouse. Agnes moved quickly despite her age, already gathering what few weapons the farmhouse possessed, an old shotgun that had belonged to her late husband, a hunting knife kept in the kitchen for practical purposes rather than protection. "We could run," Clara said, though even as she spoke the words, she recognized the exhaustion in them, the weariness of a life spent constantly fleeing. "Get ahead of him again, buy more time." "Running only delays this," Ronan said, checking his rifle with quick, practiced movements. "And running now after everything, after the magistrate's investigation is already underway, would only strengthen Crane's false story. No, Clara, this ends here, one way or another. I won't have you spending the rest of your life looking over your shoulder for a man who should have been the one afraid of consequences all along. He'll have more men than last time, Clara said, fear plain in her voice despite her efforts to steady it. More than just hired hands uncertain of the bounty. Men loyal to him, or trapped by debts they can't escape. Then we prepare as best we can, Ronan said, and we trust that Fairweather's constables arrive before things go too far. Agnes, is there a defensible position on this property? Somewhere we can hold if it comes to that gives us better ground than an open field. Agnes considered for a moment, her expression grim but steady. The barn, she said finally. Stone foundation, narrow entrances we can watch, and a loft that gives a clear view of the approach from the road. It's the best we have. They moved quickly, Ronan directing preparations with the calm efficiency of a man who had faced danger enough times to know exactly what mattered in the narrow window before it arrived. Clara found herself surprised by her own steadiness as she helped barricade the barn's side entrance, gathered what supplies they might need, and took up a position in the loft with Agnes's old shotgun resting across her knees, uncertain whether she could actually use it if the moment demanded, but determined to try rather than remain helpless. The 2 hours passed with agonizing slowness, every distant sound sending a fresh jolt of fear through Clara's chest, until finally the sound they had been dreading arrived, the rhythm of many hooves approaching along the road, more riders than Clara wanted to count from her position in the loft. She counted 6 men riding alongside Sela's crane, and her heart sank at the sight of the numbers arrayed against them. Ronan Blake, Sela's called out as his group drew rein at the edge of the farmhouse property, his voice carrying the same false confidence Clara remembered from their first confrontation, though bolstered now by the visible numbers behind him. This has gone on long enough. Hand over the girl, and I'll consider forgetting the trouble you've caused me these past weeks. Ronan stepped out from the barn's main entrance, positioning himself in clear view but carefully within reach of cover, his rifle held with easy readiness rather than open aggression. The magistrate in Ashworth is already investigating the truth of your claims, he called back. Constables are on their way here even now. Whatever you're planning, Crane, it won't undo the investigation already underway, and it will only add to the charges you'll face when it concludes. Investigations can be slow, Silas said, though something in his voice betrayed a flicker of uncertainty at the mention of approaching constables. By the time any one official arrives, this matter will already be settled, one way or another. Is that truly the path you want to take? Ronan called out, his voice carrying clearly across the distance between them. Attacking a farmhouse, threatening a widow who's done you no wrong, all to reclaim a girl who's told anyone who will listen that she left your household by her own choice. Even the men riding with you must see how thin that justification has grown. Clara watched from the loft as several of the men flanking Sela's exchanged uneasy glances, clearly reconsidering the wisdom of the confrontation they had been drawn into, much as the men on the forest road had weeks earlier. But Sela's, his pride and desperation clearly outweighing whatever caution remained in him, urged his horse forward regardless, and his men, bound by debt or loyalty, followed. What happened next unfolded faster than Clara could fully process. A chaotic rush of shouting and movement as Silas's men attempted to surround the barn while Ronan retreated to defensible cover, returning fire only when directly threatened, his aim precise and controlled even amid the danger, wounding rather than killing whenever the choice presented itself. A restraint Clara recognized even through her fear as deliberate. A reflection of the man he had worked so hard to become since his years with Voss's group. From the loft, Clara watched one of Silas's men attempt to circle toward the barn's side entrance, and without fully deciding to act, she raised the shotgun, her hands trembling but her aim steady enough to fire a warning shot into the ground near his feet, sending him scrambling backward in startled retreat. The action, small as it was, sent a fierce surge of something like courage through her chest, a recognition that she was not merely a prize to be fought over, but an active participant in her own protection. The confrontation might have continued longer, might have ended far more badly for everyone involved. Had the sound of additional hoofbeats not arrived at that crucial moment, Magistrate Fairweather himself riding at the head of a small group of constables, their approach finally turning the tide of the chaotic standoff decisively. At the sight of official law enforcement arriving, several of Silas's men immediately lowered their weapons, understanding instinctively that whatever debt or loyalty had bound them to this fight was not worth the legal consequences now bearing down on them. "Silas Crane," Fairweather called out, his voice carrying the authority of official law even amid the settling chaos. "You are under arrest for the assault of Clara Whitfield, for fraudulent claims made before this court, and for the armed assault of a private residence. Lower your weapon and surrender peacefully, or face additional charges that will only worsen your circumstances." Silas's face went through a rapid series of expressions, fury giving way to panic as he recognized the collapse of his plan, his remaining men already lowering their weapons and stepping back from a confrontation that had turned decisively against him. For a long, tense moment, Clara feared he might attempt some final desperate act, but ultimately, faced with the reality of armed constables and the collapse of his supporters' loyalty, Silas lowered his own weapon, his shoulders slumping in a defeat that seemed to age him considerably in the span of a few seconds. The constables moved quickly to secure Silas and question the remaining men, several of whom seemed almost relieved at the opportunity to distance themselves from the entire affair, offering testimony about Crane's threats and coercion that would later prove invaluable to the magistrate's ongoing investigation. As the chaos gradually settled into the more orderly process of arrests and statements, Clara finally climbed down from the loft, her legs unsteady beneath her, and found Ronan waiting near the barn's entrance, a shallow wound along his upper arm that he had clearly been ignoring in favor of ensuring the confrontation's resolution. "You're hurt," Clara said, rushing to his side, her earlier fear now replaced by fresh concern. "It's shallow," Ronan said, though he allowed her to examine the wound with a gentleness that spoke to how thoroughly their relationship had shifted over these past weeks. "Barely more than a graze. I've had far worse." "That's not comforting," Clara said, though relief was already loosening the tight fear that had gripped her throughout the confrontation, and she found herself laughing despite everything, a slightly hysterical sound born of released tension. "You could have been killed." "So could you," Ronan said gently, reaching up to brush his thumb against her cheek, checking for injuries of her own with the same careful attention he always showed. "But we weren't. We made it through together, and Crane's finally facing consequences that have been overdue for far longer than these past weeks." Magistrate Fairweather approached them once the immediate chaos had settled, his expression grave but satisfied. "The testimony gathered here today, alongside what we've already collected from Millbrook residents willing to speak honestly about Crane's treatment of you, Miss Whitfield, should be more than sufficient to see him properly convicted," he said. "You'll both need to provide formal statements, of course, but I believe this matter is very close to a proper resolution, one that finally favors the truth over Crane's fabrications." Clara felt tears prick at her eyes, relief and exhaustion and something like disbelief all mixing together, as the reality of the moment settled over her. After years under Silas Crane's control, after weeks of fear and flight and danger, the man who had caused so much harm was finally facing the consequences of his actions, and she was, for the first time in longer than she could remember, genuinely safe. Agnes emerged from the farmhouse, having weathered the confrontation with remarkable steadiness for a woman her age, and immediately began fussing over Ronan's wound with practical efficiency, insisting he come inside to have it properly cleaned and bandaged before infection could set in. Clara followed close behind, her hand finding his uninjured arm and holding tight, unwilling to let even a small distance open between them after everything they had just survived together. As the sun began to set over the farmhouse that evening, painting the sky in the same warm gold that had witnessed their quiet confession by the pond days earlier, Clara allowed herself, finally, to believe that the worst of the danger had passed, that whatever came next would be built not on fear and flight, but on the steady foundation of safety and choice that she had fought so hard, alongside the man beside her, to finally reclaim. The weeks that followed Sela's Crane's arrest passed in a blur of formal statements, courtroom proceedings, and the slow, steady process of building a case that Magistrate Fairweather assured them was as strong as any he had overseen in his years on the bench. Clara testified before the court with a steadiness that surprised even herself, recounting every detail of her years under Crane's guardianship, the arranged marriage forced upon her without consent, and the violence that had finally driven her to flee into the night and beg a stranger for rescue. Several residents of Millbrook, emboldened by the public nature of the proceedings and perhaps ashamed of their earlier silence, came forward with their own accounts of Crane's harsh treatment of Clara over the years, small cruelties witnessed and never reported, warning signs ignored out of fear or simple unwillingness to involve themselves in another family's business. Their testimony, combined with the physical evidence of Clara's bruised wrist that first night, and the accounts of the men who had abandoned Crane's failed ambush at the farmhouse, built a case that even Crane's hired lawyer struggled to meaningfully counter. The trial itself lasted only 3 days, remarkably brief given the severity of the charges, and Clara sat beside Ronan in the small courthouse gallery each day, drawing strength from his steady presence beside her, as she watched the man who had controlled so much of her life finally face judgment for his actions. When the verdict finally came, guilty on all charges, with a sentence that would keep Sela's Crane imprisoned for a significant portion of his remaining years, Clara felt something inside her chest finally unclench, a weight she had carried for so long that its absence left her almost dizzy with relief. Outside the courthouse afterward, Clara stood in the warm afternoon sunlight, watching the crowd of townspeople slowly disperse, some offering her quiet words of apology for their earlier silence, others simply nodding in acknowledgement of what she had survived. Ronan stood beside her throughout, his presence a steady anchor amid the emotional weight of the day, and when the last of the crowd had finally cleared, he turned to her with a question in his eyes that she recognized immediately. "What now?" he asked quietly. "You're free, Clara, truly free for the first time in years. Whatever you choose next, wherever you want to go, I'll support that choice completely." Clara considered the question seriously, aware that it carried far more weight than its simple phrasing suggested. For years, her choices had been dictated by circumstances entirely outside her control, first by her parents' death, then by Sela's Crane's cruel guardianship, and even during her flight with Ronan, by the constant threat of danger following close behind. Now, for the first time, the choice truly belonged to her alone. "I want to build something," she said finally, the words forming slowly as she gave voice to a dream that had been quietly taking shape within her over these past weeks. A real home, somewhere quiet, somewhere safe, not running from anything anymore but building toward something instead. "That sounds like Cedar Hollow," Ronan said, a small smile touching his lips. "Nora's mentioned more than once that the land beside her store has gone unused for years. Good soil, a reliable stream nearby. She's offered it to me more than once over the years, though I always found reasons to keep moving before now." "You mentioned once that you dreamed of raising horses," Clara said, remembering their conversation by the pond, the small, quiet confession he had allowed himself that evening. "Is that dream still something you want, or was it simply something you'd given up on entirely?" Ronan was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the same careful thoughtfulness he brought to everything important. "I stopped allowing myself to want things for a long time," he admitted. "Told myself that a man who'd been part of the harm I caused with Voss's group didn't deserve simple happiness, that constant vigilance and solitary wandering was a fair penance for old mistakes. But these past weeks with you, Clara, I've started to wonder if I've been punishing myself long after any real punishment was warranted, same as I said that evening by the pond." "Then let's build it together," Clara said, reaching for his hand, feeling the calluses earned from years of hard living against her palm. "A home in Cedar Hollow, land for horses, a life that isn't built around fear or flight anymore. I want that, Ronan. With you specifically, not simply as an escape from what came before. Something shifted visibly in Ronan's expression at her words, a lightness Clara had rarely seen from him even during their quietest, happiest moments together. I want that too, he said. More than I think I've properly allowed myself to admit, even to myself, until this very moment. They returned to Cedar Hollow within the week, and Nora Fenwick greeted the news of their plans with unrestrained delight, insisting on hosting them both properly while they began the work of building a home on the land beside her store. The following months passed in a steady rhythm of hard, honest labor, clearing land, raising the frame of a modest but sturdy house, and gradually, carefully, building the beginnings of a small herd of horses that Ronan tended with a gentle expertise that surprised even Clara, given how thoroughly the town's rumors had painted him as a figure of violence rather than quiet, patient care. The people of Cedar Hollow, small and close-knit as they were, gradually came to know Ronan Blake not as the feared horseman whose reputation had traveled ahead of him through countless towns, but simply as a steady, capable neighbor, quick to help with a difficult birth among the livestock, careful in his dealings, protective of the town in the same understated way he had once protected Clara during their journey together. The stories that had followed him for years slowly began to shift in the telling, softened by the reality of the man himself, living openly among people who had every opportunity to judge him by his actual conduct rather than distant rumor. Clara, for her part, found a quiet joy in the work of building their home, learning alongside Ronan the practical skills of tending horses and managing land, finding in the physical labor a sense of purpose and accomplishment that felt entirely her own, earned rather than granted by circumstance. Nora became something like family to her, a steady, wise presence who offered guidance without ever overstepping, and the small community of Cedar Hollow gradually became the kind of home Clara had not known since before her parents' death, a place where she belonged not out of necessity, but by genuine choice and welcome. One evening, nearly a year after that first terrifying night behind the mill in Millbrook, Clara stood on the small porch of the home she and Ronan had built together, watching him work with a young horse in the corral below, his movements patient and gentle despite the animal's initial skittishness. The scar along his jaw, once a symbol of the fear the whole region had felt toward him, had become, in her eyes, simply a part of the man she loved, a mark of survival rather than danger. Ronan looked up and caught her watching, offering a smile that held none of the guarded wariness she remembered from their first meeting, only warmth and a quiet, settled happiness that seemed to have finally taken root in him after years of restless wandering. He finished with the horse and made his way up to the porch, settling beside her with the easy familiarity of a life fully shared. "Do you ever think about that night?" Clara asked, watching the sun begin its slow descent over the hills surrounding their small piece of land. "Behind the mill when I asked you to take me with you." "Often," Ronan admitted. "It's strange looking back now. I nearly rode past that night, told myself it wasn't my responsibility to intervene in whatever trouble was unfolding. If I'd made that choice, I think about where you might be now, and where I might be too, still wandering alone, still carrying guilt I'd convinced myself was permanent." "I'm glad you didn't ride past," Clara said softly, leaning her head against his shoulder. "So am I," Ronan said, wrapping an arm around her shoulders and pulling her closer. "You asked me to take you with me that night, not fully knowing what you were asking, not knowing whether the stories about me held any truth. It took more courage than I think you've ever given yourself credit for. And you took the far greater risk," Clara said, choosing to trust a stranger's plea over the safety of continuing to ride alone, unburdened by anyone else's fate resting on your choices. They sat together in comfortable silence as the sun continued its descent, the horses settling for the evening in the corral below, the small home they had built together standing solid and warm behind them, a testament to everything they had survived and everything they had chosen to build in its aftermath. The feared horseman that Millbrook had once warned its children about had become, in the quiet reality of Cedar Hollow, simply a good man building a good life, and the frightened girl who had once begged a stranger for rescue had become a woman who had reclaimed every piece of the life that had once been taken from her. Word occasionally reached them of Silas Crane, serving out his sentence in a distant prison, his once considerable standing in Millbrook thoroughly dismantled by the trial's public revelations. Clara found, when such news reached her, that it carried little emotional weight anymore. The man who had once controlled so much of her life reduced now to a distant, mostly forgotten chapter of a story that had ultimately led her somewhere far better than anywhere he could have taken her. As true darkness finally settled over Cedar Hollow that evening, stars emerging one by one across the wide open sky, Clara felt a deep, settled contentment she had once believed impossible, given everything that had come before. She had asked a feared stranger to take her with him on a desperate, uncertain night, not knowing whether she was trading one danger for another, and in the year since, that same stranger had become her strongest protector, her truest companion, and the foundation of a home and a life built entirely on trust freely given and just as freely returned. 2 more years passed before the small farm outside Cedar Hollow truly became known throughout the county for its horses. Animals raised with a patience and skill that drew buyers from towns Clara had once only heard about in passing conversation. Ronan's reputation, once built entirely on fear and rumor, had transformed completely into something rooted in genuine respect. A man known now for fair dealing and quiet expertise rather than danger lurking on lonely roads. Nora Fenwick remained a constant presence in their lives, her general store still standing at the heart of Cedar Hollow, and she took particular delight in telling newcomers to town the story of how the feared Horseman had settled down, with a girl brave enough to ask for his protection on a night when everyone else in Millbrook had been too afraid to help her. The story, as it traveled through the county over those years, gradually shed its edges of fear and grew instead into something people told with warmth, a tale of unlikely rescue and steady, patient love built from the ashes of genuine danger. Clara gave birth to their first child that spring, a daughter with her mother's steady gaze, and everyone agreed, her father's quiet watchfulness even from her earliest days. Ronan held the small bundle with a careful tenderness that surprised the midwife attending the birth, given the stories she had heard about him in her younger years, and Clara watched from the bed, exhausted but overflowing with a happiness she had once feared she would never know, as this dangerous, feared man who had become the center of her entire world gazed down at their daughter with an expression of pure, unguarded wonder. They named her Eliza, a choice Clara had suggested gently one quiet evening, understanding without needing to be told the significance the name carried for Ronan, a small act of honoring the girl whose suffering had first set him on the path toward becoming someone determined never to stand by while harm unfolded before him. Ronan had wept quietly when Clara suggested the name, and later admitted it felt like laying down a burden he had carried far longer than necessary, transforming old guilt into something closer to gratitude and remembrance. The farm grew steadily over the following years, expanding to include a small schoolhouse that Clara helped establish for the children of Cedar Hollow, drawing on memories of her own education before her parents' death to ensure that no child in their small community would grow up without the foundation of learning she had nearly lost during her years under Silas Crane's control. Ronan, in turn, became something of an informal protector for the entire town, a role he stepped into gradually, and without ever seeking the recognition it eventually brought him, simply because he could not bring himself to stand by when trouble threatened the community that had become his true home. Word occasionally reached them from distant towns of other feared strangers, other whispered warnings about dangerous men riding lonely roads, and Clara found herself wondering sometimes how many of those stories held the same hidden truth theirs once had. How many supposedly dangerous men carried within them the same capacity for gentleness and protection that Ronan had shown her from that very first terrifying night behind the mill. She never learned the answer to that broader question, but she carried the lesson of her own experience carefully throughout the rest of her life, refusing ever again to judge a person's true nature by rumor alone, without first seeking the truth for herself. Silas Crane died in prison some years later, word of his passing reaching Cedar Hollow through a brief notice in a regional newspaper that Clara read with a strange, distant calm, feeling neither triumph nor sorrow. Simply a quiet closing of a chapter that had shaped so much of her early life, but no longer held any real power over the woman she had become. She mentioned it to Ronan that evening, and he simply nodded, understanding without needing further explanation the particular peace that came from finally being able to view an old danger as nothing more than a closed, distant memory. As their daughter grew older, joined eventually by a younger brother born 2 years after her, Clara often found herself telling them the story of how their parents had met, softened appropriately for young ears but honest in its essential shape. A story of courage and unexpected kindness found in the most unlikely of places. Eliza, in particular, loved hearing about the night her mother had pleaded with a feared stranger for rescue, and would often ask, with the persistent curiosity of childhood, whether her father had truly been as frightening as the old stories claimed before he became the gentle, steady man she knew. He was never truly frightening, Clara would tell her each time, glancing toward Ronan where he worked patiently with the horses in the corral, his movements still carrying the same quiet strength and gentleness that had first surprised her all those years ago behind the old mill. The world simply hadn't taken the time yet to see him clearly. Sometimes the people we fear most turn out to be exactly the protection we need, if only we're brave enough to ask. The farm outside Cedar Hollow remained their home for the rest of their lives. A place built not from fear or flight, but from the deliberate, patient work of two people who had found in each other something worth building toward, worth protecting, worth the risk of trusting when trust had once seemed like the most dangerous choice either of them could make. The horseman that Millbrook had once feared, and the girl who had once been powerless within her own life, had together created something far more lasting than either had believed possible on that desperate, moonlit night when a single plea, spoken with nothing left to lose, had changed the entire course of both their lives forever.